Hey guys, RBB here. Happy New Year. It's January 2nd. Hope everybody had a great Christmas, Christmas, Kwanzaa, whatever you celebrate. I celebrate Christmas. It was nice. We were in Iceland. It was lovely. Everybody always says, is it true that Iceland is green and Greenland is icy? Well, it's very true that Greenland is icy, but Iceland would not generally be called green. It was also very icy. I fell in the ice and cracked a rib. It was terrible. Anyway, that's a good thing my job involves sitting behind a computer, because if it involved like weightlifting or sheep tossing or something, I would be in trouble. Anyway, new year, new video. So I thought I'd branch out a little bit from Photoshop so that I'm talking about a couple different programs like After Effects and some Illustrator and a couple other things. Won't always be Adobe, but it seems to be the go-to ones that everybody needs to know. So and they all work together, so it's just easy to go from one to another. So I thought I'd start out the new year doing something a little different. We're going to look at After Effects today. So today is basically going to be just an overview of the workspace and the GUI, the graphic user interface, and just talking a little bit about how After Effects works. And then I'll do a series of different things and projects together like we did in Photoshop, and then eventually we'll be able to combine and switch between these different programs. So yeah, enough. Here we go. So After Effects, when you open up After Effects, you may see this screen here that basically says, do you want to open a new project, or do you want to open a project that already exists and is being saved to the cloud? If you don't see that, that's okay. One thing I noticed, and I've mentioned before, it's very weird. If I open up Adobe on one computer and I open it up on another, sometimes they open differently. Even with my students, I could open it one day and then another day in another classroom open it and it opens differently. Sometimes it opens differently on a Mac. Like, I swear it's not always the same. So if it doesn't look exactly the same, don't panic. You may or may not see this original screen that says, do you want to start a new project or do you want to open a project? Because this is actually sort of irrelevant. I could just even close this and I don't even need it. So this is the graphic user interface of After Effects. And like everything else in Adobe, a lot of things are going to be kind of in the same place, even if you've never opened a program like this before. So just looking around at where things are, think about what you do know. If you already know Photoshop or any program, let's say all you know is Word. If I said, hey, open a file, where would you go to open a file? Probably over here to File, right? File, and you'd see Open Project or New Project, right? So you already know a lot of programs. Even if you've never even opened them before, you can probably figure out where those things are. And a lot of Adobe stuff works very similar to other Adobe things. So a lot of the same menus. Over here, in the past, like in Photoshop, in a lot of programs, you'll have your tools set over here. Like we had our tool set along the side in Photoshop. And over here, it's like, well, we don't have any tools, but our tools in After Effects are often the media that we're working with, whether it's imagery or footage or sounds or graphics or whatever. When we open them up over here, kind of in our library, it's sort of our pantry of stuff to work with, of footage and media to work with. Here in the middle, we are going to have our workspace, and we're going to come back to these big old buttons in just a second, but this, just like Photoshop and everywhere else, this is going to be our workspace. This is where we're going to see our project. On our right-hand side, like a lot of programs, this is sort of the attributes, the attribute editors, the under the hood stuff, the details. In this case, it would be where we would find our effects and our presets. This is where our layers and things were in Photoshop. So a lot of things are sort of not necessarily common sense, but if you've worked in one program, you could probably figure it out and find them in other programs. And what we have down here that we don't have in Photoshop is a timeline. Okay, because After Effects is a motion and time-based program where Photoshop is not. Okay, so we have a built-in timeline down here. If we were to open up Nuke or Maya or anything else that is made for like 3D animation and editing and things like that, you would find a timeline because they are time-based programs. Okay, so that's our major windows here. Let's look at some of the other stuff. Now we do have a set of tools up here that look similar to our Photoshop tools, right? Our hand moves things around. The magnifying glass is a zoom tool. We've got lots of things that are fairly similar to what we've seen before. Now we've got some, and they're separated into little sections. There's a little line here. There's a little line here. This is going to be for camera movements. Okay, these are vector drawing. Okay, so they're just different tools that we can use to work with our footage or our media once we have something here. Coming across here, this is our workspace. In the past, when we've needed to or wanted to change a workspace, it tends to be over here somewhere. Somewhere up in the corner, and often with a little hamburger menu. So there are different workspaces, and like every other Adobe program out there, this is my default workspace. But if I prefer to work a different way or not see some of these menus or move some things around, I can move them around and of course save that workspace and save myself time. So that's cool. There are a ton of built-in tutorials and things that come with and open up with After Effects. They're great. I would recommend it. I certainly would look at these before I necessarily, I mean, here I am with a video on YouTube, but I would look at these videos before you go on YouTube and just believe the first video you come across, because if people are not trained and educated and know how to do things or why people are doing things in certain programs, you're going to come across some person who just sort of figured out how to do things, and what they're doing might work that one time, but it's certainly not industry standard or is going to set you up for failure later. So, these are tutorials from Adobe. So yeah, not that I'm saying, hey, go away and don't listen to my channel, but I am saying that you should always go to those professional sources first. Now, I am Adobe certified professional, so there you go. There is that. Yeah, different workspaces and things, and open up your different Adobe libraries and that kind of stuff here. So we got nothing going on. This is just sort of our blank workspace. So first thing we want to do, our projects here, we do have a project, and within our project, so let's say a project is going to be, I don't know, could be a television show or a film strip type thing, or some short little video you're going to make. And you might have titles, and then you might have some opening sequence, and then you might have your film, and then there might be a commercial, and there might be credits. All those different sections can be seen as sort of like compositions. They're little like folders full of stuff. So we're going to work in compositions in our project. So our new composition, to open a new composition, guess what you do? Hit this big old giant honker button that says new composition. Okay, if you for some reason don't see that, don't want to do that, whatever, you can also go up here to the composition menu and hit new composition, or for those of you that like hotkeys, Control N. But let's just click on this big old button, new composition. So like many other Adobe programs, we'll get this composition setting. In the past, it's like, well, do you want this to be 8x10? This is where we'd set up our size, RGB, all that kind of stuff. So these are the settings that we're going to set up for our motion media information, whatever we're making here. Okay, so we can name our composition if we want to. Let's just do that out of practice and say practice. I always leave underscores because a lot of programs don't like spaces. Practice session. There you go, we'll call it that. Okay, so all we're going to worry about right now is the basics. We've got our presets. Now, if you remember what we talked about in the past about 2K and 4K, 2K, which is standard high definition widescreen, is 1920 by 1080. That's high definition. Okay, and you can see that you actually have tons of choices. Now, we're not going to get into all of these. A lot of these have to do with like broadcast television. Some of them are for things outside of the country. Some of them are 4K, 8K, all kinds of different settings. But for right now, we're just going to leave this at HD 1920 by 1080. Okay, so they're right here at the top, and they move. They used to be down here. Like, it's not a big deal. Just find them that are HD, high definition, 1920 by 1080. And then we have a choice here of 24 FPS, 25 FPS, or 2997 FPS. And I'm sure there's more of them down here too, probably 30 and 60 and some other ones. So what is that FPS? This is going to be a whole video in itself later on, but this is frames per second. So you guys, I'm sure, know that film is just a series of pictures. Anytime we watch television or a movie or a video or anything, it is still images that go by at a certain speed that to our human eye appear to create movement. And how many of those pictures go by in a second, the faster it goes, the smoother it looks. So that is the frames per second. So animation tends to be in 24, 25 frames per second. Live action is often in 29.97. Now you might say, why don't they just round up to 30? A lot of this has to do with stuff that's sort of outdated now, with interlacing of frames and stuff we don't need to know about. But that is, if somebody says 30 frames per second and your only choice is 29.97, you can just confirm that's fine. Okay, it's not that big a deal. But just know that this is the speed. So essentially 30 frames per second. More pictures are going to flash up on the screen per second than in 24 frames per second. If we went slower to like 15 or 12 or 10 frames per second, that's often what things like stop motion are filmed in. Because if you think about stop motion, they make a movement, they take a picture. They make a movement, they take a picture. They make a movement, they take a picture. Well, I would rather do that 8 or 10 or 12 times per second than 24 frames per second, okay? So we'll talk about frames per second later on, but that's what that is. I'm just going to go with 25 frames per second, pretty standard. Square pixels, we're not going to get into anything fancy here. Our aspect ratio is 16:9 or standard widescreen. Okay, our frame rate is 25 frames per second. We don't need to worry about anything too fancy. Resolution is full. If we were doing like particles and a bunch of really heavy duty effects and things, we might want to work at a lower resolution so it doesn't look as good when we're working, but it doesn't take as long to render while we're working. But nothing we're going to be doing is going to require that, so we'll leave it at full resolution. And time code, it's important to understand the time code. Our time code starts 00000, so we start at 0, right? Great, just like a stopwatch. Click, starts at 0. The duration, now this looks like, if you were to look at this, this would appear probably, how long do you think this is? 30 minutes? No, this is 30 seconds. How the time code works is hours, minutes, seconds, and frames, okay, in base 25. Now again, we'll do a whole nother video about frames per second. But understand that this is frames. So just like in a clock, when we get to 55, 56, 57, 58 seconds, 59 seconds, we never have 60 seconds. It goes to 0, 0, and 1 minute. So this is no different, except for just when it hits 25, it rolls over to 1 second. Okay? And then same thing, this will roll over to a minute, to an hour. So hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. So this is 30 seconds, not 30 minutes. A lot of students of mine will change that to 30, and they're like, why doesn't this work? And it's because they've set it for 30 frames, which is basically barely over 1 second of film. So 30 seconds, and we say, okay, now a lot's going to happen. Okay, now we have this workspace, and we can see that it's 1920 by 1080. It's just a blank screen. Here is the name of our project. It's called Practice Session. It is 1920 by 1080. The change, the delta, is 30 seconds at 25 frames per second. In our little library right here, we don't have anything except for our first composition called Practice Sessions. Yay! Okay, great. And it has a lot of information here. You may need to budge up the window to see some of the other stuff that is here. The frame rate, when we have other stuff here, you'll be able to see what kind of film it is, how long it is. This is why a lot of people work with multiple 2 or 3 screens, because you only have so much real estate. Down here is our composition, our time scale, okay, our timeline. And it automatically defaulted here to 30 seconds because we told it to. We told it was a duration of 30 seconds. So here we got our timeline. It goes from 0, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, by seconds, all the way up to 30 seconds, okay? We don't have anything in here yet, but this is all set up. And this is all we're going to do today, is talk about how to set this up. We're going to do new projects. We're going to actually start a project kind of with like part 2 of this. But I want you to understand the timeline. So you've got a couple sections of the timeline. One is this big old giant sort of home base looking thing called current time indicator. And if we left click and drag on this, we can do what's called scrub through the timeline. Okay, and we can drag ourselves anywhere we want to in the timeline within those 30 seconds. And if I stop just randomly somewhere, I'm stopped between 16 seconds and 18 seconds, I can see right over here that I am at 16 seconds and 19 frames. Okay, if I randomly click right here, I am at 9 seconds and 9 frames. So I can left click and jump to that spot, or I can left click and drag this to a spot. So I can jump to here, jump to here, jump to here, or I can drag it back and forth. Okay, so there you go. That's your time slider. Now there's 2 gray bars here. Okay, this one down here is your work area. Let's say I'm working on a 2-hour film, okay, but my scene is only like 10 seconds long. Okay, I don't want to have the whole 2 hours when my little section is just right here. So if I want to work on some smaller part of my entire project, I can shorten my work area. So I'm going to left click and see it's got a little arrow with a like a stopper kind of right here. Okay, I can move this over, and let's say my job is to work on something that happens between 10 seconds and let's say 13 seconds. I'm going to grab this end and move that to 13 seconds. Okay, so now my workspace is not going to take up, it's not going to have to render all of this or all of this. If I were to press play or render it, it's only going to render these 3 seconds right here, which is going to save me a ton of time. That would be like rewatching an entire movie. If you were like, what did they just say? And instead of rewinding and replaying that one section, you had to go through the whole movie. So this would be my works section. Okay. Well, let's say I'm working on something even smaller than that. Like I'm working on 1 second. I'm working on between 10 and 11 seconds. Well, that's a really tiny workspace, and definitely the Germans didn't design this because that's a terrible use of space. So I need to zoom in on that. That is this top slider. So in this top slider is sort of like a zoom. I'm going to focus in tighter and tighter. So see I'm narrowing my focus, and I can keep narrowing this in to where now see it's going per second, 10 seconds, 11 seconds, 12 seconds, 13 seconds. If I keep focusing this in, it's going to switch in just a second to go to frames. Okay, so now I'm focused way in, and I'm starting at my 10-second mark. Okay, 10 seconds and 5 frames, 10 frames, 15 frames, 20 frames, 25 frames, boop, to 11 seconds. So now my workspace is not so teeny tiny if I was working on something as short as 1 second. Okay, or even like 1 or 2 frames. If you're doing some kind of special effects, you might be working on a couple of frames. You might want to like totally match up when an explosion happens, or a zero cut when somebody drops something and it turns into something else. Like you've seen those videos where a person drops a Rubik's Cube and it turns into Skittles. You would want to focus in on that exact moment when you switch between the film of the Rubik's Cube and then cut to the Skittles. Okay, so that's what these sliders do. This is my work area. Okay, and this focuses in. It's sort of like a zoom. Okay, so I'm going to drag this all the way back out. So I'm looking at my whole timeline, and I'm going to change my workspace all the way out to my whole 30 seconds. Now, this is something my students run into a lot of times. If I were to work on a project right now and were to render it and output it, my workspace is set to render the whole 30 seconds. But let's say that in grabbing this and in sliding these things around, I accidentally grabbed this one and drag it all the way over here. That doesn't look really weird, okay? We don't see half a gray bar. That gray bar is gone, and you may not even notice that I've squashed it all the way down to 1 frame. So I do all this work, and it's still going to let me see all this, and I'm going to do all this work, and everything is great. I've got this 30-second fantastic film, and I go to render it, and I play it, and it's 1/25 of 1 second long, and everybody's freaking out. Why won't it work? My composition is set to 30 seconds. Why doesn't it work? Okay, this is a troubleshooting thing. Check to make sure that you didn't accidentally squish your workspace down to 1 frame. Okay, so that is just a quick overview of the workspace. And we're going to do a part 2 where we're going to start bringing in some layers. We're going to animate some things. We're going to do all kinds of cool stuff. So I hope you join me for the rest of the After Effects series, but take a minute to just, get familiar with the workspace, and we'll be back. Thanks. Be well.